An outline of esoteric science. Cassette 13, first side, religion. The mysteries of heaven and earth, revealed to the third race by their celestial teachers in the days of their purity, became a great focus of light, the rays of which became necessarily weakened as they were diffused and shed upon an uncongenial, because too material, soil. With the masses they degenerated into sorcery, taking later on the shape of exoteric religions, of idolatry, full of superstition and man or hero worship. Alone a handful of primitive men, in whom the spark of divine wisdom burnt bright, and only strengthened in its intensity as it got dimmer and dimmer with every age in those who turned it to bad purposes, remained the elect custodians of the mysteries revealed to mankind by the divine teachers. There were those among them who remained in their chimeric condition from the beginning, and tradition whispers what the secret teachings affirm, namely that these elect were the germ of a hierarchy which never died since that period. That's from the second volume of The Secret Doctrine, page 281. This quotation is an important one, in that it tells something of the real source on this earth of religion, both as it was in its pristine purity and then of what it became. The celestial teachers were those who had reached full manhood in the moon chain and came to this earth as teachers. They had finished their human evolution and didn't incarnate into the chayas or forms provided by the lunar petries. These were at a lower stage of development. The teaching of the celestial teachers became a great focus of light. This light has persisted throughout the ages, but now shines, except through some few illuminated men, into the world only from behind a screen of superstition and ignorance in the exoteric religious forms. In some of these the light is so obscured as to be hardly perceptible, but in some the veil is thinner and beams of the pure light penetrated here and there. The real teaching is the original inspiration behind the classical religious literature of the world. It is least obscured where the old wordings have suffered least from translation and interpretation, often with willful or unwitting modification. In the latter case, we have to learn to read between the lines, to sift the wheat from the chaff of embellishment or the insertion of material to justify a dogma of the day or an historical antecedent or prophecy. It is difficult to discuss esoteric science vis-à-vis modern religions. That science is properly religion itself in its purity, the fount and origin of all religions, antedating any religious form. This original knowledge is that of the celestial teachers referred to in the opening extract, whereas all current denominational religions are, in their essence, or originally may have been derived from the truths given us by the ancient teachers or their successors in knowledge, but they are now sadly changed from their pristine state. Because of this obscuring and dilution, some hard things are said about modern religion by the masters of the wisdom, themselves members of that enduring hierarchy referred to in our opening paragraph, and by HPB. Students could easily form the opinion from these remarks that esotericism is anti-religious. This is the very reverse of the truth. It is religion. It has been said that the ancient wisdom is not a philosophy, it is philosophy. In the same way, it is not a religion, it is religion. It therefore couldn't be anti-religious any more than it could be anti-scientific or anti-philosophical. What it can be and is anti-false religion, anti-pseudoscience, and anti-purely disputative philological philosophy. HPB quotes Ammonius Saccas of Alexandria thus: "The religion of the multitude went hand in hand with philosophy, and with her had shared the fate of being by degrees corrupted and obscured with mere human conceits, superstitions, and lies. But it therefore ought to be brought back to its original purity by purging it of this dross and expounding it upon philosophical principles, and that the whole which Christ had in view was to reinstate and restore to its primitive integrity the wisdom of the ancients, to reduce within bounds the universally prevailing dominion of superstition, and in part correct and in part exterminate the various errors that had found their way into the different popular religions." That's from chapter 1 of The Key. And she added to that, "This again is precisely what the modern theosophists say. Since Ammonius, of course, matters have become much worse, particularly in the Christian religion, with its dogmatic assertions and its tampering with the books of the Bible, mainly those of the so-called New Testament, to justify its theological dogmas. We must draw a clear distinction between ethical codes of behavior as such and religious thought and practice in the wider context. Ethics have been proved necessary, and their codes have evolved and been established purely on the grounds of social necessity. For human society to persist at all, there must be some rules. To enforce them, however, fear was soon found to be efficacious. What better to instill fear than an angry God? Perhaps initially this was how ethics and popular religions came to be so closely allied. Another reason for a code of ethics more in line with real religion is true spiritual development, necessitating the purification of a would-be seeker after truth. Ethics of the highest standards are indispensable for that purpose. Religion, in its proper meaning, has to do with the process of man's spiritual regeneration, so that he, as an earthly personality, can regain an effectual contact with his higher self, his own divine ego, which, as we have seen, is inseparable from the universal self. This process is of particular concern to those of the human race on this earth whose development has reached the evolutionary stage that we have called the arc of ascent, for the unfolding of their latent spiritual potentialities. On the descending arc, men become more and more material and concerned with the development of their purely personal attributes, so as to become competent actors on the physical world stage. We are told the lowest point of this process was, as far as our humanity is concerned, in the fourth root race. From then on, most of us have been coming up to the ascending arc. We have turned the corner, so to speak, but our upward progress, out of our almost total immersion in materiality, is very slow. In the meanwhile, in our benighted state, we have suffered from the degradation of religion into superstition, and because of misguidance and the lack of proper constraints, we have done much else to impede rather than promote our progress. The definition of superstition is interesting. It is an ignorant and irrational belief in supernatural agency, a deep-rooted but unfounded general belief. With the increase of materiality from the third root race into the fourth came an increasing ignorance of spirit. There's a passage referring to this as follows: communication between heaven and earth. Since then, that is the fourth race, there has been no more going up and down. And H.P.B. explains, going up and down means untrammeled communication and intercourse between the two worlds. And further she says, as the coats of skin of men thickened, that is, they became more densely physical, and they fell more and more into physical sin, the intercourse between physical and ethereal divine man was stopped. The veil of matter between the two planes became too dense for even the inner man to penetrate. Men then became ignorant of their essential divine nature. They forgot it. That quotation's from the second volume of The Secret Doctrine, page 281. But there was still a tradition of the gods, the teachers, the supermen, the heroes, the myths and legends, both national and religious. It was, however, the lower mind mostly to which these appealed. The veil between the lower and the higher having become impenetrable, it was at this time that the idea of God with all his human attributes was born. In quoting, we have, the idea of God is not an innate but an acquired notion, and we, that is the masters, have but one thing in common with theologies: we reveal the infinite. But while we assign to all the phenomena that proceed from the infinite and limitless space, duration and motion, material, natural, sensible, and known, to us at least, cause, the theists assign them spiritual, supernatural, and unintelligible and unknown causes. The God of the theologians is simply an imaginary power, a power which has never manifested itself. And our chief aim is to deliver humanity of this nightmare, to teach men virtue for its own sake, and to walk in life relying on himself instead of leaning on a theological crutch. This is from a letter from a master, Mahatma Letters, page 53. There are a number of statements in the Secret Doctrine to the effect that the masters who wrote these letters are in direct line from the elect who remained on earth to teach infant humanity. They still carry the torch of truth. We should heed them, but many of us are loath to do so because of our strong attachment and loyalty to much in our religions that we have come to regard as sacred. Among these things is our idea of God. But for us, the idea has become a reality. It would be unthinkable that there might not be a God as we have conceived him to be. The Master had some other emphatic things to say about religious notions from which it was their chief aim to deliver humanity. These notions are those man-made ones which fundamentally undermine and even negate truth, and are the source of so much evil, strife, and suffering. Unjustified mere belief, blind faith, these are the causes of much of the bitter dissent, the cruelty and division among peoples of the world. Because we too are blind, we cannot, in some cases will not, see or admit our own blindness. The Master stresses this point. I will point out the greatest, the chief cause of nearly 2/3 of the evils that pursue humanity ever since that cause became a power. It is religion. Under whatever form, and in whatsoever nation. It's the sacerdotal caste, the priesthood, and the churches. It is in those illusions that men looks upon as sacred that he has to search out the source of that multitude of evils which is the great curse of humanity and that almost overwhelms mankind. Ignorance created gods, and cunning took advantage of the opportunity. Look at India, and look at Christendom and Islam, at Judaism and fetishism. It is priestly imposture that rendered these gods so terrible to man. It is religion that makes of him the selfish bigot, the fanatic that hates all mankind out of his own sect, without rendering him any better or more moral for it. It is belief in God and gods that makes 2/3 of humanity the slaves of a handful of those who deceive them under the false pretense of saving them. That's from Mahatma Letters, page 57 and 8. This is an awful indictment of religion as we know it. Many of us, because of our cherished beliefs, do not want even to look at the possibility of its truth. Too much is at stake, and we are fearful of losing what we have felt to be so precious. What the Master wrote, well, however, was particularly true when it was written 100 years ago. It's still true today, but in a modified way. Western ideas, mostly through science and technology, have liberated the thinking of many people the world over. The distractions of modern life have taken men's minds away from religion. Education has made man less fearful and to a degree less superstitious. Many superstitious ideas have been undermined by modern knowledge, and the power of the Church, particularly in the West, has to a large extent been severely weakened, if not broken. On the other hand, we now have strong nationalist movements with their roots in religious traditions. The list of illustrations of this is long. Hindu against Muslim, Christianity at loggerheads with them both. Judaism obstinately maintaining a foothold in its claimed historic birthplace. Protestants and Roman Catholic Christians killing each other in Ireland. Outside of all these, the militant materialism of communism. What hope of human unity is there among all these? On a doctrinaire, man-made of course, basis, their differences are irreconcilable. It is these man-made theological dogmas that are divisive. It is not the fundamental basic qualities inherent in the nature of all men that create differences. Man's nature is essentially the same everywhere, regardless of his religious beliefs. And the Master goes on to say, remember, the sum of human misery will never be diminished unto that day when the better portion of humanity destroys, in the name of truth, morality, and universal charity, the altars of their false gods. That's from Mahatma, the 10th letter, Mahatma Letters, page 58. The ancient wisdom is, as said, religion, not a religion. It is non-denominational and non-sectarian, provided it is not interpreted in man's own sectarian and egotistic way. We must remember what the Master has said above about their chief aim, and of what H.P.B. said in the Key, chapter 3, regarding the third object of the Theosophical Society, viz., to oppose and counteract, after due investigation and proof of its irrational nature, bigotry in every form, religious, scientific, or social, and cant above all, whether as religious sectarianism or as belief in miracles or anything supernatural. What we have to do, she says, is to seek or obtain knowledge of all the laws of nature and to diffuse it, to encourage the study of those laws least understood by modern people, the so-called occult sciences, based on the true knowledge of nature, instead of, as at present, on superstitious beliefs based on blind faith and authority. These two aims place on those who subscribe to the doctrines of the esoteric science, first, a large responsibility to acquaint themselves with these doctrines, and second, to oppose and counteract bigotry and cant. To do this, however, we must know the doctrines. It may surprise some students to see that an esotericist should counteract a belief in miracles and anything supernatural. Most people would say, but is it not that what esotericism or occultism is all about? In a number of places, however, we are told, and we have now seen it for ourselves, that there is nothing, nor could there be anything, above or outside of nature. There can therefore be nothing supernatural. Everything is embraced within the total unity, outside of which there is nothing. There can't ever be an outside. Similarly, to ascribe any happening to a supernatural cause, as indeed we might do in the case of a seeming miracle, is a nonsense, because nothing can happen outside of the universal law. A so-called miracle must be in accordance with the law, with antecedent causes giving rise to present effects. If the seeming miracle is wrought by anyone, that someone must be acquainted with the nature and processes of nature herself, and must be able to manipulate the forces, that is, the elementals, involved. It may appear from these remarks that we are taking an uncompromising view of the world's religions, but in the light of what has been said, we can perhaps see why. First, all the scriptural writings are for the public. None of them contain esoteric doctrine, although in some of them it is referred to in symbol, story, and parable. In some, the spiritual teachings are of the highest order, as for example in the Bhagavad Gita or the Yoga Sutra aphorisms of Patanjali that we've already mentioned. Exoteric religions, with their usages, instructions, and practices, and their priesthoods, and all the ritual they have devised, have grown up around these relatively pure teachings. It is from and in these interpretations that superstition arises. The priesthood devise means to maintain the position of their institutions and indirectly of themselves. The declared purposes of our traditional religious ceremonials are manifold. They commit us to God as infants. They confirm us in our faith in adolescence. They sanctify our weddings, bless our enterprises, guard our households, even safeguard our entry into the next world. Sometimes our devotions aim to appease God or whatever powers there be, or our religion supports our prayers for whatever it is we feel we need, for blessing on ourselves or our loved ones, and so on. For many of us, this is woven into the very fabric of our lives, and nearly all of it involves priests as go-betweens between us and God. Somehow we have come to believe and accept that they are specially qualified. It's worth asking who put this idea about. We are not here overlooking the seriously devout, good-living people who derive much support, strength, and comfort from their religion. For many sincere adherents, their faith is the center of their lives, providing a model for behavior and an object of devotion. In these things, their religion fulfills a need, a deep and spiritual need. For the most part, however, religious rituals, public and private, have been devised to meet all the occasions mentioned above. But the gods themselves have never said that they wanted them, nor what should be done. Man, in his role as priest, invented it all, and by doing so ensured a job for life. And this is not mere cynicism. We don't realize to what extent we have been educated into the feeling that some, if not all, of this conventional religious background to our lives is indispensable to our happiness, safety, or even prosperity. How many of us dare openly to challenge the system established over centuries? Many of us now just let it go by default. If we carefully review the parts played in our lives by our religion as outlined in the above list, we can, if we will, see to what it is that the masters are calling our attention. It is that all ritual and prayer involves God or gods. Such an idea is myth. Let the student look back over the material given in these cassettes, and he must see that in no sense is there room for anything such as men have commonly come to regard as a personal God. There are mighty beings, but their role as creators or governors is within their function, itself in turn within the limits imposed by law. They can, for example, have no special regard for each of the countless individual units of life, quite insignificant as single life atoms, comprising the totality of the grand scheme of things, whatever their collective role and effect. How could the individual welfare or interests of any one of us as a unit in the whole of humanity be of any moment whatever, when seen in a cosmic setting, or be of special interest to a collective creator? Particularly is this so when this welfare and those interests which so concern us relate only to our personality, and not to our divine self, which, however, we must never forget is of the same order of being as that of those same creators and governors. To what, or to whom, then, are our supplications addressed? Who or what will be affected by our rituals, our sacred ceremonies? Ceremonial, we are told, derives from ceremonial magic. In one form, this was sorcery, practiced by our fourth race ancestors. But these ancestors of ours were powerful magicians who used their powers for selfish and ignoble purposes. They committed sacrilege against true religion, but from what they did, some of our ceremonial as we know it was derived. When properly done, it can invoke the rulers of the elements and elevate or modify man's consciousness. But as most religious ceremonial is now performed in the average temple or church service, it does little else than stimulate us emotionally. Its effective magical power is negligible. It relates us now only to an imaginary deity. Included in ceremonial are appeals to our better nature and a reminder of the virtues, sometimes against a divine example. Our customary religious usages now include those of dress, headgear, food, holy animals, preservation of caste, holy days, even holy places and cities. To be freed from all this, our minds must somehow be wooed away from what, after all, are obvious trivia. But men must not be deprived of religion. True religion is essential to their well-being and happiness. The esoteric truths relate man to deity itself, to the very essence of cosmos, which is also his inmost essence. They acquaint him with universal, everlasting law, utterly inexorable, but perfectly just and merciful in the only feasible way. Being of the nature of the cosmic process, the law cannot be diverted or propitiated. It always pays us back in our own coin, bad for bad, good for good, be it sooner or be it later. It is the stern, perhaps, but also a beneficent teacher, without which we would never learn. External religious observances in themselves cannot possibly have any effect on this ever-acting law, except as they may affect our behavior. Obviously, insofar as the devotee subscribes to them and observes them, they do something to, and therefore for, him. They are a discipline. He has to remember them. They turn his attention to things other than the mundane routines and concerns of ordinary life. But couldn't disciplines be provided to do all this, but at the same time be in line with the cosmic processes? Well, we shall see. Having seen that God, as a being, as an entity, is, in the ordinary sense in which the word is used, a myth, a figment of imagination, a man-made concept, an idea, we must now ask, what about prayer? In line with the esoteric doctrine, as a whole consistent teaching, we have a passage wherein the idea of God and then prayer as a practice is discussed. An inquirer asks, do you believe in God? Answer, that depends on what you mean by the term. Inquirer, I mean the God of the Christians, the Father of Jesus and the Creator. In such a God we do not believe. We reject the idea of a personal or extra-cosmic and anthropomorphic God, who is but the gigantic shadow of man, and not even of man at his best. The God of theology, we say, and prove it, is a bundle of contradictions and a logical impossibility. Therefore, we will have nothing to do with him. That's from the Key, chapter 5. Another question. Do you believe in prayer, and do you ever pray? We do not. We act instead of talk. Do you ever offer prayers even to the absolute principle? Why should we? The unknowable is capable of relations only in its parts to each other, but is non-existent as regards any finite relations. The visible universe depends for its existence and phenomena on its mutually acting forms and their laws, not on prayer or prayers. And the inquirer then asked whether there is any other kind of prayer than supplication. Most decidedly, we call it will prayer. It is rather an internal command than a petition, addressed to our Father in heaven in its esoteric meaning. In our sense, the inner man is the only God of whom we can have cognizance. Prayer is not a petition, it's a mystery rather, an occult process by which finite and conditioned thoughts and desires, unable to be assimilated by the absolute spirit which is unconditioned, are translated into spiritual wills and the will, and such a process being called spiritual transmutation. That's from the Key, chapter 5. From all these quotations and thoughts about religion and its relation to us, what are we to believe and do? If a man can't pray, whence his help, his comfort, his certain background, that up to now he has looked to his religion and his God to provide? As long as a man needs, or feels he needs, these sustaining and comforting things, why should he change? Only because they are superstitiously based and diminish his self-reliance and his sense of responsibility. Esotericism may destroy his beliefs, but it restores his own self-respect. But if he doesn't find his present religion satisfying, if it doesn't answer his questions, if he finds no certainties in it, what then can he do? He is now earnestly enjoined to study the philosophy, to act on its principles as far as he can. Then he must seek out and teach his neighbour, surely also in need of help, and tell him of so much as he has learned, and how, by making sense, in the proper sense, of life, how it has helped him. Teaching is not only the most powerful aid to learning, but specially to growth in understanding. Done in sincerity and humility, it works miracles. Miracles within the teacher, but it is his own work that works them. Learning is a slow process, but a sure one. Gradually, belief is replaced by knowledge. Understanding and confidence grow. We come to dare to stand up on our own. We sense our own essential identity with God. We come to know that we need no aids that are not available to us in ordinary life. We begin to see our ceremonies only for what they are, at best incidental help along the way. But we do come to learn that there is a religious regime which furthers progress, growth of comprehension, and internal, satisfying happiness. The basis of this is regular application, with as much time devoted to it as possible. But it is all done in the normal circumstances of life, with all its attendant relationships and duties, which can't be neglected. They are part of the scheme. What should our aspirant do? He must study, as far as he can, some esoteric literature. This will provide him with knowledge and a perspective view of life. He should also find and read regularly for his guidance a scripture. Now this should be an accepted one, that is, one that accords in basic teaching with the occult teaching as far as he has discovered it, and one that he feels an affinity for. He must think much about what he reads. He contemplates the theories he is learning about in relation to what he knows or can discover about nature, and then in relation to the general content of the spiritual teachings. This he must do for some time every day. If he can, get together with like-minded students periodically for some community activity, be it only discussion about what he and his fellows are studying, not general lay topics. He will learn much from the interchange, learn to receive as well as to give, and make valuable friendships. These things, relatively few in themselves, will soon have a profound effect on his life and his relationships. He will notice a slow taking command of himself, a growth of awareness, a willingness to be helpful, a better organization of his time, a more positive, self-determined attitude to life generally. and possibly a growing affection for his associates. He's on his way, religiously. That's the end of cassette 13, first side. Please run the tape onto the end and turn the cassette over. An outline of Esoteric Science, cassette 13, second side, religion. On the first side of this cassette, we drew attention to the fact that the formalism of the world's religions was man-made. Behind all religions, however, there are essential truths, ultimately based on truth itself. But what is this ultimate truth? What relation could it have to the necessarily relative truths of our mundane existence? HPB examined this problem in an article she wrote for her magazine Lucifer for February 1888, and in this she quotes a verse by W.T. Bacon, Thoughts in Solitude. Truth is the voice of nature and of time. Truth is the starting monitor within us. Naught is without it. It comes from the stars, the golden sun, and every breeze that blows. She further says in her article, in every age there have been sages who had mastered the absolute, and yet couldn't teach but relative truths. For none yet born of mortal woman in our race has, or could have given out, the whole and final truth to another man. For every one of us has to find that, to him, final knowledge in himself. As no two minds can be exactly alike, each has to receive the supreme illumination through itself, according to its capacity, and from no human light. The greatest adept living can reveal of the universal truth only so much as the mind he is impressing it upon can assimilate, and no more. Because of this impossibility of imparting truth, Jesus, when asked what it was, is reported to have remained silent. In time, such silence of our teachers, maintained not because of their unwillingness to impart it, but because of our incapacity to receive, has, as HPB says, led gradually to dogmatism and assertion. Dogmatism in churches, dogmatism in science, dogmatism everywhere. But the possible truths, hazily perceived in the world of abstraction, like those inferred from observation and experiment in the world of matter, are forced upon the profane multitudes, too busy to think for themselves, under the form of divine revelation and scientific authority. But the same question stands open from the days of Socrates and Pilate down to our age of wholesale negation. Is there such a thing as absolute truth in the hands of any one party or man? Reason answers, there cannot be. That's from the 9th volume of Collected Writings, page 31. This passage then clearly divorces truth itself from dogma and revelation. Whence then our religions? Their origins must be in the remote history of our race. There are a number of references to the origins of religion in the literature, and one of them, a long one, not only ascribes the origins of religious sense in man to the time when divine beings, the Jan Chohans, walked the earth and mixed freely with mortals, but gives us the origins of much else in the symbolic literature and practices of our religions. What was the religion of the third and fourth races? In the common acceptance of this term, neither the Lemurians nor yet their progeny, the Lemuro-Atlanteans, had any, as they knew no dogma, nor had they to believe on faith. No sooner had the mental eye of man been opened to understanding than the third race felt itself one with the ever-present, as the ever to me unknown and invisible all, the one universal deity. Endowed with divine powers and feeling in himself his inner God, each felt he was a man-god in his nature, though an animal in his physical self. The struggle between the two began from the very day they tasted of the fruit of the tree of wisdom, a struggle for life between the spiritual and the psychic and the physical. Those who conquered the lower principles by obtaining mastery over the body joined the sons of light. Those who fell victims to their lower natures became the slaves of matter. From sons of light and wisdom they ended by becoming the sons of darkness. They had fallen in the battle of mortal life with life immortal, and all those so fallen became the seed of future generations of Atlanteans. There's an important footnote here. The name Atlanteans is used here in the sense of and as a synonym of sorcerers. The Atlantean races were many and lasted in their evolution for millions of years. All were not bad. They became so towards their end, as we, the fifth race, are fast becoming now. At the dawn of his consciousness, the man of the third root race had thus no beliefs that could be called religion. That is to say, he was equally as ignorant of gay religions full of pomp and gold as any system of faith or outward worship. But if the term is to be defined as the binding together of the masses in one form of reverence paid to those we feel higher than ourselves, of piety as a feeling expressed by a child towards a loved parent, then even the Lemurians had a religion, and the most beautiful one from the very beginning of their intellectual life. Had they not their bright gods of the elements, not the elementals, but their rulers around them, and even within themselves? Was not their childhood passed with, nursed and tended by those who had given them life and called them forth to intelligent, conscious life? We are assured it was so, and we believe it. For the evolution of spirit into matter could never have been achieved, nor would it have received its first impulse, had not the bright spirits sacrificed their own respective super-ethereal essences to animate the man of clay, by endowing each of his inner principles with a portion, or rather a reflection, of that essence. The jhanis of the seven heavens, the seven planes of being, are the noumenoi of the actual and future elements, just as the angels of the seven powers of nature, the grosser effects of which we perceive in what science is pleased to call the modes of motion, the imponderable forces and whatnot, are still higher noumenoi of still higher hierarchies. It was the golden age in those days of old, an age when the gods walked the earth and mixed freely with the mortals. Since then, the gods departed, that is, became invisible, and later generations ended by worshipping their kingdoms, the elements. It was the Atlanteans, the first progeny of semi-divine man after his separation into sexes, and hence the first begotten and humanly born mortals, who became their first sacrifices to the god of matter. They stand in the faraway dim past, in ages more than prehistoric, as the prototype on which the great symbol of Cain was built, as the first anthropomorphists who worshipped form and matter. That worship degenerated very soon into self-worship, thence led to phallicism, or that which reigns supreme to this day in the symbolism of every exoteric religion of ritual, dogma, and form. Adam and Eve became matter, or furnished the soil. Cain and Abel, the latter the life-bearing soil, the former the tiller of that ground or field. Thus the first Atlantean races born on the Lemurian continent separated from their earliest tribes into the righteous and the unrighteous, into those who worshipped the unseen spirit of nature, the ray of which man feels within himself, or the pantheists, and those who offered fanatical worship to the spirits of the earth, the dark, cosmic, anthropomorphic powers with whom they made alliance. These were the earliest Gibberim, the mighty men of renown in those days, who became, with the fifth race, the Kabirim, Kabiri with the Egyptians and Phoenicians, Titans with the Greeks, and Rakshasas and Daityas with the Indian races. Such was the secret and mysterious origin of all the subsequent and modern religions, especially of the worship of the later Hebrews for their tribal god. This is from SD2 272-4. On this latter notion, much of the theology of subsequent Christianity was based. If dwelt upon long and earnestly, this long passage sheds a flood of light on religion as a human propensity. It is in and of his essential nature. In esotericism, there is much about the descent of spirit into matter, the necessity for the divine man to incarnate and evolve through the races of mankind on earth, and so gain the necessary experience for his evolution to self-conscious spirituality, his long journey home again. The legend of the fallen angels is an allegory of this process. The matter side of existence, that of darkness, ignorance, and limitation, is behind the satanic myths. Referring to the descent of spirit into matter in relation to man's involvement in a physical body and his eventual regeneration, the SD has this to say: on a firm grasp of this doctrine depends the correct understanding of esoteric anthropogenesis. It gives a clue to the vexed question of the origin of evil. It shows how man himself is the separator of the one into various contrasted aspects. That's from SD2, page 274. The origins of and the raison d'etre of religion, as we have seen, is bound up in the minds of modern man with the idea of God, and God as a being, the creator and governor of the universe. One of the purposes for the imparting of some hitherto esoteric teaching was deliberately to release the vast majority of mankind from the thraldom of this idea. Not much thought is required to see what havoc the various versions of the God idea, held sacred by their adherents, has wrought and still does in human history. Together with material greed and the desire for power by way of political domination, the divisive effects of religious beliefs under whatever creed constitute the main single cause of mankind's strife and suffering. This statement, of course, accepts suffering through physical ailments, which, as we have seen, are the hereditary karmic results of long-standing habitual wrong living. To return to the God idea and religion, however distasteful it might be to the student initially, he should read and ponder deeply on the content of the following passages from a letter by one of the adepts. The master began the letter with some explanations about their philosophy. He said it was the science of things deduced from first principle, and added concerning the matter of God, nevertheless, we deny most emphatically the position of agnostics in this direction, that is, God. And as regards the solar system, our doctrine knows no compromises. It either affirms or denies, for it never teaches but that which it knows to be truth. We know there are planetary and other spiritual lives, and we know there is in our system no such thing as God, either personal or impersonal. Parabrahm is not God, but absolute, immutable law. The word God was invented to designate the unknown causes of those effects which man has either admired or dreaded without understanding them. And since we claim, and that we are able to prove what we claim, i.e. the knowledge of that cause and causes, we are in a position to maintain there is no God or gods behind them. Answering objections to their assertions of the impossibility of a personal God, the God of the theologians, the master submitted a number of arguments which are mainly summarized as follows. 1. We deny the absurd proposition that there can be, even in a boundless and eternal universe, two infinite, eternal, and omnipresent existences, that is, a God and a universe distinct from one another. 2. Matter we know to be eternal, that is, having had no beginning, A, because matter is nature herself, B, because that which cannot annihilate itself and is indestructible exists necessarily, and therefore it could not begin to be, nor can it cease to be. And C, because the accumulated experience of countless ages and that of exact science show us matter or nature acting by her own peculiar energy, of which not an atom is ever in an absolute state of rest, and therefore it must have existed always. That is, its materials ever changing form, combinations and properties, but its principles being absolutely indestructible. 3. As to God, since no one has ever or at any time seen him or it, unless he or it is the very essence and nature of this boundless, eternal matter, its energy and motion, we cannot regard him as either eternal or infinite or yet self-existing. We refuse to admit a being or an existence of which we know absolutely nothing, because A, there is no room for him in the presence of that matter whose undeniable properties and qualities we know thoroughly well, and B, because if he or it is but a part of that matter, it is ridiculous to maintain that he is the mover and ruler of that of which he is but a dependent part. And C, because if they tell us that God is a self-existent pure spirit independent of matter, an extra-cosmic deity, we answer that admitting even the possibility of such an impossibility, that is, his existence, we yet hold that a purely immaterial spirit cannot be an intelligent, conscious ruler, nor can he have any of the attributes bestowed upon him by theology, and thus such a God becomes again a blind force. That's from my letters 53 to 55. The master pursued these arguments further, but the gist can be deduced from what he said above and from what has been said in the previous cassette. Now, however, we must see another aspect of the popular religions of mankind, in which, with the exception of Buddhism, the idea of God is a fundamental, and that is the question of evil. Evil, for our present consideration, is anything which causes men avoidable suffering. Quoting, "Evil has no existence per se, and is but the absence of good, and exists but for him who is made its victim. It proceeds from two causes, and no more than good is it an independent cause in nature. Nature is destitute of goodness or malice. She follows only immutable laws when she either gives life and joy or sends suffering and death and destroys what she has created. Nature has an antidote for every poison, and her laws a reward for every suffering." The master repeats, "There is no evil as such in nature," and then says, "The real evil proceeds from human intelligence, and its origin rests entirely with reasoning man, who dissociates himself from nature. Humanity, then, alone is the source of evil. Evil is the exaggeration of good, the progeny of human selfishness and greediness. Think profoundly, and you will find that save death, which is no evil but a necessary law, and accidents, which will always find their reward in a future life, the origin of every evil, whether small or great, is in human action, in man, whose intelligence makes him the one free agent in nature." That's from Mahatma Letters, page 57. Man's diseases, as we have seen, are the result of heredity through constitutions of mind throughout generations of wrong living. Reverting to the master's letter, food, sexual relations, drink are all natural necessities of life, yet excess in them brings on disease, misery, suffering, mental and physical. And behind all there is selfishness. Such, says the master, is the cause of 1/3 of the problem of evil, and the remaining 2/3, as we saw on the first side of this cassette, is due to religion, the sacerdotal caste. Since this letter was written, the Western world has seen the dramatic decline of religion, but it has not been so much in the name of truth as out of apathetic indifference. Religion has come to mean less and less, and now has little or no part in the lives of many millions, both in the East and the West. There has, however, with the abandonment of the altars of their false gods, been no significant increase in morality nor in universal charity. To its cost, humanity has simply been de-religionized. Men are now free, but they are still deplorably ignorant of their proper spiritual status and heritage. Nevertheless, the religious urge remains strong, sometimes very strong, in many men, despite the lack of any well-founded logical basis for it. The devotion of many millions to their gods and religious beliefs is genuine and is of significant help to them in their lives, and it must be remembered that within the religious systems have been the world's holy men, the saints and sages. What then does the occultist condemn so severely? It is the man-made beliefs and dogmas and religious usages that he condemns. The heads of religious institutions, their writers and teachers have been responsible for these. Further, these authors have been unacquainted with the real nature of cosmos and man. They have, at least in the West, anthropomorphized God and degraded man. In the East, they have largely personalized their gods and traded on the ignorance and superstition of the ordinary man. The Buddhists uniquely have commonly never accepted the idea of God or any divine eternal principle, either in cosmos or man, and they have kept their ethics free from a logically unacceptable theology. But again, many of them have also rejected any idea of esotericism behind their religion, and thus have severed their religious teachings and usages from their cosmic origins. Any sincere inquirer after truth must surely agree with the above general statements by the masters. He can, by so doing, start his search free from the conditioning ideas inculcated in him in his upbringing from his very earliest years. But this is very difficult. What Christian can really rid himself of the idea of God as a supreme being, an entity, sometimes even referred to as a person, somewhere beyond the confines of known space, taking an interest in, governing all his creation? Or of the idea of Jesus having been crucified to save him? The Christians among us have all been imbued with such ideas almost before they could talk. But if we would know truth, we must dare to be free. Let us discover what is mere idea and what is not. In esotericism, who or what, apart from the God we have believed in, could be the object of our prayers? It would take too long to reiterate what we have said already, which really answers this question. Students are best advised to seek and fearlessly reason out answers for themselves. Some bold statements, however, could perhaps prevent us from trying to reconcile what are really irreconcilables, that is, esotericism and popular religions. Let nothing here be taken to be a denial of the possibility of genuine mystical experience, nor to denigrate the value of real religion and its effective aids. For example, some of the great religious books of the East. The student, however, should beware of Western scholars' interpretations and commentaries on these. The student who seeks seriously truth should make the attempt to discover for himself the authenticity or otherwise of much published religious teaching, particularly where the obscurities of dogma are involved. While one can never discover the secrets of nature by mere logic, nothing in nature is illogical. The truth behind all religious teachings, which must obviously ultimately relate to nature, therefore cannot be illogical. A good exercise for students with a Christian background would be to read the Reverend Dr. C.F. Potter's The Lost Years of Jesus Revealed, for some puzzling little-known facts about the origins of the Bible story, and particularly about the New Testament. For those with the time to read it, H.B.B's Isis Unveiled is very enlightening and liberating. On the other hand, much Christian tradition can be reconciled to the occult view, and for this, William Kingsland's books on the Gnosis are important works. It is impossible here even to give the gist of these books, but the student in real earnest is recommended to read them, and to do so in a spirit of courageous discovery, open-eyed and unafraid of what he might find. We said above that the religious urge is present in many people. Such an urge is inexplicable apart from man's essential inner spiritual nature. It could, however, be legitimately related to what in religious circles is called faith. Now, this should not be taken to mean unquestioning faith in dogmatic assertions, but, quoting, this perception of the manas may be called faith, which should not be confused with blind faith. Blind faith is an expression sometimes used to indicate belief without perception or understanding, while the true perception of manas is that enlightened belief, which is the real meaning of the word faith. This belief should at the same time be accompanied by knowledge, that is, experience. For true knowledge brings with it faith. Faith is the perception of the manas, fifth principle, while knowledge in the true sense of the term is the capacity of the intellect, i.e., it is spiritual perception. In short, the higher individuality of man, composed of his higher manas, the sixth and seventh principles, should work as a unity, and then only can it obtain the divine wisdom. The divine things can only be sensed by divine faculties. Thus the desire, which should prompt one to apply for chelaship, is to so far understand the operations of the law of cosmic evolution as will enable him to work in harmonious accord with nature, instead of going against its purposes through ignorance. That's from Collected Writings, Vol. 6, page 240. Note, chelaship is another name for discipleship. Such is the grand object of the study of occultism. We come to learn of our inescapable intimate relationship with nature, as natural beings ourselves. Universal law is therefore the law of our being. This law is that of progress, development, growth, unfoldment, ever becoming, with perfection in prospect, not only for ourselves, but for all creatures and things, our companions on the way. And so we enter the ways of true religion in inseparable unity with all things and the all of which, in relative or absolute terms, constitute truth, the only one. Another quotation summarizes the important background to many of the world's religious ideas, which it relates to the teachings of the ancient wisdom as follows. As to the latter, that is, the aggregate of the Jan Chohans and other forces, they are dual in their character, being composed of A, the irrational brute energy inherent in matter, and B, the intelligent soul or cosmic consciousness which directs and guides that energy, and which is the Jan Chohanic thought, reflecting the ideation of the universal mind. This results in a perpetual series of physical manifestations and moral effects on earth during manvantaric periods, the whole being subservient to karma. As that process is not always perfect, and since, however many proofs it may exhibit of a guiding intelligence behind the veil, it still shows gaps and flaws, and even very often results in evident failures. Therefore, neither the collective host, the demiurgos, nor any of the working powers individually are proper subjects for divine honors or worship. All are entitled to the grateful reverence of humanity, however, and man ought to be forever striving to help the divine evolution of ideas, by becoming, to the best of his ability, a co-worker with nature in the cyclic task. The ever unknowable and incognizable Karana alone, the causeless cause of all causes, should have its shrine and altar on the holy and ever untrodden ground of our heart, invisible, intangible, unmentioned, save through the still small voice of our spiritual consciousness. Those who worship before it ought to do so in the silence and sanctified solitude of their souls, making their spirit the sole mediator between them and the universal spirit, their good actions the only priests, and their sinful intentions the only visible and objective sacrificial victims to the presence. As we have seen, this presence is our own Father, which is in secret. It is within us, our seventh principle, in the inner chamber of our soul perception. The kingdom of heaven and of God is within us, not outside anywhere. And that's a quotation from the first volume of The Secret Doctrine, page 279, and footnote. There is no religion higher than truth, and of these things there can be no end. And that's the end of cassette 13, second side.